Hey, 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 it's Tania, aka the Cool Auntie, and this is the Cool Auntie podcast. Listen, last week was a lot. Um, I'm processing a lot. I think it's a false narrative to be happy all the time. I think it's okay. I'm a firm believer that it's okay to have raggedy weeks and raggedy moments. And last week was one of mine. I had a raggedy last week. Not even gonna lie. Matter of fact, so much so that it made me think back to a few months ago, um, when I had my niece over here, and so I wanted to kind of share with y'all a little bit about that, especially as we kick off this new series, Broken Crayons Still Color. And so my brother was in town for a birthday party, one of his childhood friends. And he asked me to babysit. And so I watched my niece. And we started to color. We were actually coloring. I didn't even know I had a coloring book, to be honest. But then I found this Stoner's coloring book that I had gotten from LA. Before you judge me, raggedy, okay? So may I suggest, parents, that when you're bringing your kids over, you don't just bring over the iPad, because the iPad is all cool and good. But let's just say, hypothetically, the iPad falls in the tub during our spa day. What are we supposed to do? Okay? We get creative with what we have. So I suggest, parents, before you judge me, that you bring over some alternative toys. Okay, I ain't got no kids. So unless you want them crawling on the floor with Jaffe, bring something else. But I digress. Anyway, and we had fun. But we were coloring. And remember I reached for, my favorite color is green. I had reached for a green crayon. And she was like, Nene, don't use that one. It's broken. I'm like, so? I'm like, it's still color. She's like, yeah, but don't use that one. Use this one. It's prettier. And I was like, okay, girl. And so I took the crayon and I was coloring with it, but she made me think about something, right? Because mind you, my niece is only like 4 or 5. And so if at 4 and 5, she's programmed to believe that because a crayon is broken, it shouldn't, I won't say couldn't, but it shouldn't be used. It made me think, what do we as adults, what kind of perspective do we have on this idea of being broken, or the state of being broken, which is brokenness. Right? Because to be honest, there's no such thing as a perfect crayon. Not in the literal use of a crayon, but even in this analogy, right? Because we are all crayons. As humans, we're crayons, right? We're all put here with purpose, right? We are all designed uniquely different. So just how there's different crayon colors in a box, each of us brings something unique and different to the world, right? And God brought us here to color, right? And so just how there's no perfect crayon in a box, at least not one that's used. If it's never been used, sure. But one that's actually been used, there's no such thing as a perfect crayon. And so, of course, as I'm thinking about her and thinking about this, and mind you, in my profession, I'm a coach and a trainer. And so I essentially, not with psychology background, so I essentially study and research the mind and behavior all day. So she got me to thinking, especially after my last week where I'm like, ugh, I just kept feeling so attacked last week. I'm not sure about everybody else, but and then DMX dying on top of all of that was just like, and that's my baby. So it was just a lot happening. But it got me to really thinking about, what does brokenness look like? And so I start I started that process how I start all of my other processes, which is of course a definition. Okay, your girl went to the Google. When when all else fails, go to the Google. Google will always tell you what you need to know, right? And so I started to look up this idea, like, what does brokenness mean? And so, like I mentioned before, in this podcast, we look at things in both a practical and a spiritual lens, right? And so when I looked up brokenness, I looked it up in both a practical and a spiritual lens. And so looking it up in a practical lens, brokenness was defined as forcible separation into two or more pieces or parts. A forcible separation into two or more pieces or parts, right? I think the key word in that is forcible, which for me would hint at things like trauma, because forcible is a really high impact word, right? I think also looking at this idea of two or more pieces, which means it's taking it from its original state and breaking it into fragments or to pieces, right? I even looked up synonyms of the word broken and brokenness, and words like damaged came up, right? And we use that word a lot, people being damaged. Even like I think back to last week with DMX and how he is, mind you, definitely one of my top 5 favorite rappers, but I think he's arguably one of the best, and he's a legend. But people still felt the need to shed so much light on his brokenness, as if that somehow took away from the fact that he was talented and took away from the fact that he was a legend, right? Y'all see Jaffe just minding his business. But this idea of forcible separation into two or more pieces, right? Damaged, altered. What was also very unique is that when I went from the word broken to the word brokenness, it said the same thing, but it added a little clause at the end. And it was like, to the point of defeat, surrender, or hopelessness, right? So they had that forcible separation, right? The breaking into the many pieces and parts, to the point of defeat, surrender, or hopelessness, right? And so, mind you, I'm reading it and I'm absorbing all these definitions. And so I wanted to, and so if you're like me, as I was thinking through it and processing it, I'm like, oh, I've been here before, right? I've been broken many a times before. And now that I think about it, I didn't know it was brokenness at the time, but I've definitely felt forcible separation into many parts over the course of my life. And so I think too, even as you're thinking about how brokenness may play out in your life, I think it's important to recognize that brokenness looks different for everyone. I can't wait to get to that segment in a couple of weeks where me and a few of my friends and colleagues kind of break down how brokenness has played out in our lives. But even for you, recognizing that what brokenness may have and may currently look like for you will not look like somehow it looks for somebody else, right? I think it's also important to acknowledge that everyone either is or has been broken in some way at some point. I think we live in this world sometimes where it's hard to see that because we don't always project that, especially on things like social media and in the media. But everyone at some point has been broken if they are not currently broken in an area. And mind you, to be broken, you can be broken in one area and not broken in another. And so that got me to thinking about, okay, right? All that makes sense, right? But what does it actually look like? Like, how does brokenness actually play out in life? And so, again, more research led me to looking at something called Graw's theory, in which it explores the 4 basic human needs. Now, some of you might be familiar with like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and those are valid. But that looks more at the holistic person. Graw's theory focuses primarily on the psychological needs that we as humans have, and there are 4 basic ones. Mind you, these may all show up and look differently for everyone, but what I am saying is that everyone has these 4 basic needs, right? The first one is attachment, right? We all have a desire and a need for attachment or connection, right? We all want to be loved. We all want to love. We all want to connect with other people. Maybe not everyone, but we all have a desire to connect, right? So the first need is attachment. The second need is control or security, right? I think we've all, especially after this past year, recognized that there are levels and layers to what we can control. But we all, deep down, we desire security, we desire stability, we desire to have an ounce or an area of control, right? Number three would be pleasure, right? We all desire things that make us feel good, right? For me, it's food sometimes, right? Or it's experiences, or it's people, or it's things. So we all desire things that make us feel good. And then lastly, it's self-enhancement. It's this idea of the things that help feed our understanding and our sense of self, whether that's self-esteem, self-image, confidence, self-perception, right? Things that contribute to our sense of self, right? And so we all have those four basic human needs, at least in a psychological sense. And so you're like, Tania, why are those important? It's important to know that because number one, those are the areas that we experience brokenness the most. But number two, those also control our behaviors, right? What we experience in those four areas controls how we show up. Again, not taking us too far in the psychology class. I want you to think of it almost like this. You might have heard terms like fight or flight before. That usually refers to what happens to a person when they are threatened or when their senses are triggered. Okay? And so that doesn't just happen with your body physically, right? That also happens to your body mentally and to you mentally and emotionally. And so when one of your four basic needs, so attachment, control, and security, pleasure, or self-enhancement, when those are threatened and or triggered, they draw out a behavior or a response. So for an example, in relationships, right? So the idea of attachment. If you experience high levels of trauma, of disappointment, of stress, of anxiety, and heartbreak in the area of attachment, you do one of two things. You avoid or you approach. You avoid or you approach. So if you ever meet people who are like, I'm not looking for a relationship, that usually comes from that's what avoidance look like. It's people who, okay, I've experienced high level of threats and triggers in the area of attachment. And so I am choosing to behave moving forward through avoidance, and that I don't want to be associated with that thing. Right? You also, and mind you, it's not always bad. Sometimes you might have, so for example, people who you meet who are very ambitious and they are motivated by success in their careers and like in their jobs, right? Usually that stems from what they get out of their job. They feel a stronger sense of self. People who connect their identity to their success and to their job, they're high driven, right? Because this idea of, okay, this makes me feel good. This increases and enhances my sense of self. And so rather than avoiding it, I'm going to approach it. Right? I'm going for it. I'm setting goals and I'm achieving it. And so in life, those four basic needs, as they're triggered and as they're threatened, it controls how we behave in both a positive and a negative way. You may have heard the saying, or at least I know I've heard it before, is that everyone is running from something and everyone is running towards something. I'm going to pause for a second because that's a lot to take in. Right? Everyone is running from something and everyone is running towards something. Right? And so as we experience life, things are constantly threatening our four basic areas of our human needs. And so as things are threatening and triggering them, we're choosing to either avoid and or approach them, which means that we're either running from something or running towards something. And many a times we're doing both, right? And so you're like, Tania, okay, all of that makes sense. Why is that important, right? Why is that important? Because many reasons how we choose to show up and how we behave determines how we're using our brokenness, but also whether or not we are breaking other people. Right? Just like crayons, we are mishandled and misused and abused by people, both intentionally and unintentionally. Right? We're being dropped. We're being stepped on. We're being handled roughly, by people who don't value us or don't recognize who we are and how to deal with us, right? And so we end up hurt. And I think it's important to acknowledge that hurt, that both being mishandled and experiencing hurt is inevitable, right? But I think it's also important to realize what are the effects of being hurt, right? First, we all heard that saying of hurt people, right? If I've been in a relationship and I've experienced levels of hurt, I'm taking that trauma and that hurt into a new relationship where I'm hurting somebody else, right? So if I've been a broken crayon, I'm going out and I'm breaking other crayons. Number two, if I'm not breaking you, I'm bleeding on you. So that's also common, especially in relationships where we're taking the hurt from a previous relationship and we're bleeding on the next person and we're punishing them for mistakes that they did not make, right? We're treating them in a way that has nothing to do with them, right? So if we're not hurting them, we're bleeding on them. And mind you, if you're bleeding on them, you're also hurting them, right? Or for some of us, which I can relate probably the most to this, is that once we've experienced being broken, we stop coloring, period. Right? Okay, if I didn't try this thing, I've tried relationships and they aren't working out for me, I'm like, you know what? Bet. I'm going to go sit in the box. And I ain't coming out the box because it's safer in the box. I'd rather be in the box and not be used and to not be colored than to go out in this world and have people out here mishandling and misusing and abusing me. Right? And so even today, we're constantly complaining about the world being broken and us living in a broken world. But may I argue that a broken world is made up of broken people. And so if we spent less time critiquing the world for being broken and instead look at people and their brokenness, we might actually change something. And so when I think back to my experience with my niece and even over the course of my life, I'm so passionate about brokenness because I have been a victim to other people's brokenness. Hurt people have hurt me from birth. Hurt people have hurt me. I have seen how people hurting, broken people have broken other things. I myself have broken people because of my brokenness. And so I got into my profession. I got into coaching. I got into teaching. I got into training because I recognize that, and I might argue that just how hurt people, I also believe that healed people heal people. Right? And that if we spent more time and energy healing people, that when those people are healed and whole, they can go out and heal other people. And so I do that every day. But this podcast is just another area or a venue or a place where I can do that in my own way. And okay, and you're like, okay, Tania, all that makes sense. I get it. I get what brokenness means. I get that I might be broken or I am broken. And I get how it shows up, but what does that have to do with me? I think as we start thinking about, I keep hearing, the streets are calling my name. I'm going to the streets. Okay. You're going out there, but before you go, may I ask, how are you going to look when you get there? Okay, like we get it. Like the world is opening up. We got vaccines out here. Things are beginning to emerge, and we're talking about this idea of a new normal, and everyone's excited about getting back out. But my question is, who are you going to be, and how are you going to be when you get out? Is the real question. When I look at what's happening in the world today, I wholeheartedly believe that we live in a world where people forgot that we weren't just here to be crayons sitting in a box. We aren't here to just be crayons just existing and just living. We are here to color. We are here for purpose. And we can't act like the pandemic didn't break us. Like the pandemic didn't take us in some ways, not all of us, but in some ways, it made it hard for you to want to color. I speak about my experience all the time, but I did not want to color. I had been so broken and so damaged in areas that I didn't want to color. And that's why I'm so grateful to God, because in the times in which I didn't want to color, He found a way to give me strength. But more importantly, He always reminds me that I'm not here for me. And just like I'm not here for me, you aren't here for you. Somebody's waiting on you to know who you are so that you can color for them. All right. And so this series, Broken Crayons, is really about us learning how to color again. And I won't lie to you and tell you that it's going to happen in the next 6 weeks. It's a process. I am somebody who's still learning to color. I'm still learning to color, and it's definitely a process. But it's possible. And it starts with changing your mind. As a coach, as a trainer, I always tell my clients that when it really boils down to it, change, any kind of change, comes with changing your mind, because wherever your mind is, everything else follows. And so, if nothing else with this podcast, I would love to just change your mind. Change your mind and change how you view yourself, change how you view the world, change how you even viewed your experience through the pandemic. But more importantly, to change your mind about coloring again. And so over the next 6 weeks, I want to kind of explore what I call the 5 principles to coloring again. For those of you like Tania, listen, I heard you. Now that I'm hearing what brokenness sounds like and what it feels like, I am broken, right? Whether I was broken before the pandemic, whether I was broken during the pandemic, or I'm trying to figure out if I'm broken now, as we come out the other side of it. Whatever that looks like for you. If you're like, you know what, Tania, I am broken, and I want to figure out, how do I color again? Over the next 5 or 6 weeks, we get to kind of explore what I'm calling the 5 principles of coloring again. And so, before I kind of leave you alone today, I wanted to go through them really quick, and we'll of course unpack them over the course of the next couple of weeks. Um, the first principle I might offer is that Satan is after your heart, my love. Ultimately, that's what he's after. Um, I, I recognize that everybody's different in their level of spirituality, but I think a prime example of this is Job in the Bible. Long story short, Job was a faithful servant of God who one day, of course, the devil not having nothing better to do, said to God, like, you know what, listen, Job only serve you because you give him everything that he wants. If you take away all of that, he ain't going to serve you no more. And God was like, yeah, okay, try it and see. And so that's what Satan did. He took away things from Job. Ultimately, right? He didn't take him away because he cared about the things. He didn't care about Job's possessions. He didn't care about Job's family. He didn't care about that. He cared about how Job perceived God. He cared about Job's heart. And so all that he attacked and all that he took away was his attempt to change Job's heart. And so I might argue is that Satan is after your heart. That's why Proverbs, one of the book of wisdom in the Bible, says to guard your heart above all else, because your heart is the most precious thing. Your heart is a door. That's how Satan gets in, right? Think about it. Through heartbreak, he comes in through bitterness, through jealousy, through envy, through hate. All of that comes from your heart and how you respond to what happens to you. You ever hear, you hear about how, like, life isn't about what happens, but about how you respond to it. That's true, right? Because this idea that brokenness is inevitable, but how you respond to it is everything. And Satan knows. So just how we know that, he knows that too. And so many a times when he's attacking you, it's because he's after your heart. And so we're going to talk about that in this series. The second principle is you have to be real to heal. I'm seeing all these things about authenticity, and I think it's great because, again, growing up, that was not what we were taught at all. Like, we said it, but we didn't actually create environments for authenticity. But to see that kind of spark, even with brands online, everyone's promoting this idea of authenticity. But I also would argue the same rules apply, I think, in healing. In that you can't fix what you're afraid to admit is broken. I'll admit that I've experienced high level of trauma and brokenness, and I was so determined to appear like I wasn't broken that the people who God sent to help me couldn't help me. I didn't let him in to help and to heal me. I was closed off to opportunities for healing because I wasn't willing to admit that I was broken. I wanted to be cool. I wanted to be okay. And so I think it's really important that for those of you people who are like, you know what, I want to overcome my brokenness. That's cool, but you have to first acknowledge and be okay with saying I'm broken in this area. And this is how, and this is why. Which I think leads to principle number 3, which is really that healing is really all about perspective. Again, that idea that it's not about what happens to you, but how you react to it. So, mind you, trauma comes in different forms. I can tell you firsthand from my experience and from even the folks that I coach. Sometimes trauma happens and you had nothing to do with it. Right? That's from childhood when you're younger and your parents' decisions. So sometimes like trauma happens and you had nothing to do with it. You're just experiencing it. You are a victim to somebody else's choices. Right? But then also sometimes trauma happens because you happened to you. Right? It's easy to play victim, but even I can admit that some things have happened to me because of the decisions that I made and things that I chose to do, people who I chose to be with, places I chose to go, situations that I knowingly got myself into. And so just how those things are happening to us, healing also happens in that way. And that's really about how are we choosing to look at it? How are we choosing to process it? And so many a times, again, kind of going back to principle number 2, many of us are rushing to look like we're healed, that we aren't actually healing. And so even throughout the course of this week, I want to actually process, what does healing look like? I think for many of us, how we define healing and how we see healing is actually different than what it really is. I think one thing I can't wait to explore more into is grief. I think a common misperception to grief is that you have to lose something through death to experience grief. But to be honest, grief, it just means that you care. If you are grieving anything, if you've ever grieved anything, all it means is that you cared about a thing. So you can grieve a relationship, you can grieve a job, you can grieve an opportunity, you can grieve a location, a place. If you moved, like you can grieve without actually experiencing death. And many a times going through the stages of grief is necessary for healing. And so I want to change people's perspective of healing, right? Which leads to principle number 4. And I think that this one might be one of the hardest to swallow because it's easier. It's one of those things that's easier said than done, right? And that sometimes you have to break to build. I can admit that in my brokenness, that yes, I gave people the power to take things from me, good things from me, like my confidence and my self-esteem and my self-worth and all of those things, right? But also in that my brokenness, I also had to unpack some attitudes and behaviors that I inherited that weren't necessarily healthy, right? God had to break me to change my mind about some things. You know, how I viewed womanhood, how I viewed love, how I viewed value. Sometimes, you know, God, and mind you, not always God, but He uses everything for our good, right? But sometimes we experience brokenness so that we can rebuild and build into, and God can build us into who He's actually called us to be, right? We tend to say things like, "Oh, it's just who I am. It's just who I am." Well, well, while yes, I agree that some things are just who you are, some things aren't actually who you are. It's just all you know. And so sometimes God will break us to expose us to what we don't know so that we can know better and do better. And so I want to explore this idea of how is brokenness sometimes the foundation in the way that God builds us. Which brings me to my last principle, and that is there is power and purpose in your story. There is power and purpose in your story, my love. What would you say if I told you that many a times the area in which you were being attacked the most, the area where like you like, dang, I just can't catch a break. I just can't get a dub. Like, what's going on? What if I told you the area that you were being attacked the most in is probably the area that God wants to use you in? And again, that's from both lived experience and my coaching experience. Myself, my brokenness wasn't just one traumatic event. Like for some people, they have one traumatic thing that happens and that changes their life forever. I think when I view my brokenness, and we'll talk more about this in the coming weeks, for me, it was like a death of 1,000 cuts, in which my identity and my view of myself, my self-perception was constantly being challenged. I experienced high levels of abandonment and rejection, and like ostracization that really challenged how I viewed myself. And I think that was from an early age. And I think even now as I'm stepping into who I believe God is calling me to be, I realize that because I think it's because the devil knew that the key to me walking in my purpose was knowing who I was. He knew that my power was in my confidence. He knew my power was in me knowing what I brought to the table and knowing that even though I was different and unique, it was for a reason. And so he tried his best to make sure that I didn't know that I didn't feel that. And so I might argue that even for you, and as you think and throughout the course of this week, I want to challenge you to really think about what area are you experiencing brokenness? right? And how might God be using that, right? How might your area that you're being broken the most, or you feel the most broken in, how might that be connected to your purpose? How can God use you in that area? How can your story impact someone else? Like I told you before, those are questions that I don't feel like anybody can just answer in the moment. And these are all questions that I told you I had on sticky notes on my wall for months. Some for like over a year. Because they aren't easy questions. I don't even feel like I'm not saying that you all will be able to answer all of those questions at the end of the 7 weeks. But I want you to start thinking about that. I even encourage you to follow us on social media at _ the Cool Auntie. We try to provide like reflections and exercises and things online throughout the week, so that way to kind of help you to be thinking about some of these conversations. But also I wanted to have a space where y'all can talk back to me about how you're processing some of this information, because it is a lot to unpack. And so I definitely encourage, you to do that. But really thinking about, what does brokenness look like for you? And what does learning to color again look like for you? Because it's possible. There was a time where I didn't think it was possible. But by the grace of God, it is. And just like it's possible for me, I think it's possible. I know it's possible for you. And I just can't wait for this series. I can't wait to bring some really great people in to really unpack this. I can't wait to hear about your broken crayon stories. But more importantly, I can't wait to hear about how God is going to be using you all as we head back to the streets. I told you I'm having a hot, wholesome summer, okay? And I mean that. We're out here healing, okay? We're being hot and we're healing at the same time. Can I do that? I can do that. I can do whatever I want to do. We're going to do that. But be okay with saying I'm broken in this area. And even if you don't say it to me, be okay with saying it to God. Because He can't heal what you don't reveal. He can't fix what you don't admit is broken. But the great thing is that, again, we all own being raggedy. So broken or not, we can still be used. But more importantly, it's all a part of God's plan. And so speaking of plans, I got to get my nails fixed. I was playing with your cousin the other day, and we got a little rough, so I broke one. I got to get my nails fixed. But something to think about over the course of this week. Can't wait to hear from you. Oh, yeah. I love you. Call me back. Switch.